On that front, I wanted to talk a little bit about SACNAS, but since you brought up the legal aspect, I know, why don't we start with you, Jim, just briefly, and then we go to everybody else on this topic. What do you think about the tactic that's being deployed here of blocking the road? I mean, I think it's clear that it is illegal, but I guess that's going to be debated. But as a tactic going forward, as a form of protest, there's a discussion about how it's civil disobedience, it's protection, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. Do you think that's a tactic that our society should allow going forward?
Yes, and I think you have to understand the motivations and psychology of movement politics. From a movement standpoint, it doesn't matter what anybody else thinks. Movement politics are the politics of 5-year-olds who throw themselves on the floor and kick up their feet. Anything other than their point of view is wrong by definition. And ultimately, they're not out to win a case. We know that because they lost the case and they're still fighting the same battles. Movement politics is about emotion and delay. If you delay anything long enough, it will die. And their hope is delaying the telescope long enough, it will die. As the Supreme Court said in Brown versus the Board of Education, justice delayed is justice denied. So to the extent that we fall into the trap of thinking it's okay, there are two conclusions you can make. Yes, everybody has a right to a belief. Everybody, you, me, everybody in this room has a right to a belief. None of us, however, have a right to impose that belief on anyone else. And that's where the line has to be drawn. Mayor Arakawa in Maui faced a very similar situation in Haleakala. And he said from his point of view as the executive of Maui, it was simple. You cite them for trespass, it's a $50 fine. If you came up again, you cite them again, and that's a $500 fine. And within a week, it stopped. And so to the extent that there are legal tools that people can have for civil disobedience, that's an extra legal tool. But we're not talking Gandhi here. This is not that kind of movement. There is not an inherent injustice that compels people of moral conscience to support the denial of at least 100 Hawaiian scholars every year for 10 years the opportunity to raise themselves up and their families. Our pressing needs as Hawaiians are health, both physical and mental, housing, and the inordinate number of us that are incarcerated. Every one of those issues are issues of poverty. So if the TMT is going to provide 100 scholarships for Hawaiian scholars potentially, that is a tide that lifts at least 100 boats in the first year. If my friends who want to deny the opportunity for the TMT prevail, I am still dealing with health, housing, and incarceration.
Anybody else want to weigh in on this question of the tactic that's being used in particular? Or we kind of covered it. Go for it.
Just to kind of share my personal thoughts on this. I truly empathize with the protesters. I can understand why they feel suppressed and oppressed. But it's not the telescope that is doing that to them. And so they have sadly painted a target on this telescope for issues that are not the telescope's doings.
What explains that?
So, of course.
Why are they picking on TMT?
Because they don't have guns. The astronomers don't have guns. There's Pohakuloa, 3 miles away from where they're set up right now, but they are not presenting their problems to them because they have guns. If you think, I'm sure you guys have a picture of
Oahu that, no offense, but I know most of us can afford. And I don't know, like you said, homelessness is a big problem. So I don't know everyone is for that. Just saying.
Mm-hmm.
You know why they pick on you? You're science nerds, and you pose no threat. I mean, it's a riff off of the gun thing, but that's not really it. When you talk to UH people, when you talk to scientists, what they want to do, what they think they're doing, is having a rational conversation. So if the Kiai are talking to you and making demands, you're thinking, all right, how do I accommodate this? Movement politics is not about achieving any of those. It's about delaying you. And so every opportunity to accommodate every single demand is in the plan. Every one. Whether it's protecting the environment, protecting the plants, protecting sacred sites, every single demand has been accommodated in the plan. It turns out it wasn't about accommodation. So movement politics is not about accommodation or compromise. Movement politics is about winning and you losing.
I just wanted to add, I had the honor of having several panels this semester with one of our philosophy and gender and women's studies professors at UH Hilo. And her stance, was to support the Kiai. So I'm definitely going to come from a more academic side and maybe not as rational. I don't know.
I definitely want to. I was actually going to ask you about this coming up, so please.
But, she definitely spoke a lot to this idea of civil disobedience and how that is, one of our rights. And I agree that, we should have that space to, if we feel like something's wrong, we need to be able to express that. We need to be able to stand up for that. If we don't have that, then how can we affect change when something we feel is happening that is wrong? And so in that sense, I think it's been a really tough time, I think, in the sense of trying to understand the leadership of who makes decisions about who can go up the mountain, why, it's civil disobedience for the purpose of, standing up for very many different things. But when we hear the messages coming from the Kiai, there are so many different things aside from TMT that are being brought up. And so it's hard to, I don't know, how do you address these issues?
TMT is the scapegoat for a plethora of ills. By
it's natural to some degree, right?
Yes, but we cannot confuse civil disobedience and equate that with the denial of someone's lawful right. To the extent that there is a permit issued and there's a lawful right to use the mountain, someone's political expression against that does not give them the right to stop the lawful activity. So that's where we're getting kind of confused here. Our natural cultural tendency is for accommodation. That was the first thing I spoke about when we started this, is that we are inclusive as a culture and we want to give everybody the opportunity to be heard. But that's not their point. They don't want to just be heard. They want to be obeyed. They want to impose that conclusion that they've reached, that there might be some sacred motivations that prevent the telescope. But if that were the case, then they should have stopped, or should right now stop, the Royal Hawaiian Shopping Center in Waikiki that has the most sacred stream that runs from Manoa to Waikiki called Apukehau, and the sacred coconut groves that were established there for 1,000 years in the middle of the most gaudy, and you could argue the most grotesque development. But we're not protesting that. I want 100 Hawaiian scientists a year. I don't need another 100 waiters or housekeeping, as honorable as waiting and housekeeping is. Big brain guys like these kids, who still have their hair. And that means they can affect the future. I'm on the downhill slope.
I will say, just acknowledging when I get upset, I don't always do the thing that you think you should do to make yourself feel better, right? And I see that here because, I've seen my family go through stuff that is not lawful and it should have been lawful, right? The law has not always protected my family. And so at that level, I see this as, it's a natural product of being upset with the system and how you've been treated by the system, and I think that's fair. Not that I'm anyone to say that, but that's just my perspective. But again, I think we're dealing with a bunch of different people that are up there and a bunch of different perspectives, and it's really hard, how do we move together to finding a resolution when there's not one central issue to address?